The Civil War was a time of hardship, survival, and resilience. With the conflict stretching for years and supply lines often cut off, soldiers and civilians alike had to get creative when it came to food. What might surprise you is the strange and unconventional foods people relied on to stay alive during this tumultuous period. From roasted squirrels to hardtack biscuits, these unconventional meals were a testament to human ingenuity in the face of scarcity. In this video, we'll take a deep dive into some of the most unusual foods consumed during the Civil War and explore how these choices help shape the daily lives of those living through one of the most difficult chapters in American history. If you're fascinated by the untold stories of survival from this pivotal time in American history, don't forget to subscribe and join us for more unique insights from the Old West. Rice and molasses. Rations during the Civil War typically consisted of basic staples like salt beef, salt pork, flour, and water, along with essentials such as salt, sugar, coffee, and vinegar. However, meat was not always a reliable part of these rations. In the South especially, logistical barriers often prevented supplies from reaching the soldiers, leaving them to rely on whatever food could be sourced locally. As a result, substitutes for meat became necessary. One such replacement was a simple combination of rice and molasses. Sometimes cooks or soldiers would add cornmeal to stretch the meal further. Molasses, while not unfamiliar in the region, was initially seen as a less than ideal substitute for sugar. After the Confederacy's sugar supplies dwindled, molasses became the primary sweetener for many soldiers. While molasses was widely used, it was far from popular. Its distinct, sometimes bitter taste was difficult to adjust to, particularly for those accustomed to the sweetness of sugar. Confederate troops, however, had little choice but to make do. For some, the combination of rye and cereal with molasses became a mainstay, though it often came with unpleasant consequences. Historical accounts suggest that this mixture, while nourishing, could cause severe illness for those who consumed it, even if they were accustomed to the harsh diet. Despite the potential for sickness, soldiers adapted to the taste, learning to appreciate its utility, if not its flavor. What started as a necessity eventually became a part of their daily lives, highlighting the hardships of wartime survival. Coffee. Coffee was a beloved drink for both Union and Confederate soldiers during the Civil War, but it wasn't always easy to come by. With supply lines frequently disrupted, the availability of coffee became a serious issue. As a result, soldiers had to get creative and use whatever ingredients they could find to mimic the flavor and warmth of coffee. This led to a range of substitutions, with soldiers brewing concoctions made from peanuts, chicory, rye, peas, and even apples. Other unconventional options included acorns, dandelion roots, and sweet potatoes, all of which could be dried and processed into a coffee-like beverage. One particularly resourceful method, described by Confederate General J.E.B. Stuart, involved potatoes. Soldiers would peel and chop them into pieces resembling coffee beans. These potato pieces were then left to dry in the sun, parched until they turned brown, and finally ground into a coarse powder. The resulting grounds were mixed with a bit of water to form a paste, and hot water was added to create a drinkable brew. Once the grounds settled at the bottom of the pot, the beverage was ready to be poured, offering a drink that soldiers could rely on during long days of battle. Real coffee beans, however, were considered rare and precious commodities during this period, particularly in the South. In fact, coffee was so scarce that it was sometimes substituted in unusual ways. In Atlanta, for instance, some jewelers even use coffee beans in place of diamonds when creating decorative breastpins. The coffee brewed in the field was far from the rich, aromatic beverage that non-combatants might recognize today. Instead, it was often made by boiling ingredients in an open kettle, resulting in a muddy, dark drink the color of a brownstone. While this concoction didn't have the refined taste of commercial coffee, it still provided warmth and a sense of comfort to soldiers enduring the harsh realities of war. Slosh. Slosh was a basic and filling meal that soldiers often relied on during the Civil War, made from simple ingredients like bacon, grease, and flour. To make slosh, soldiers would start by frying bacon in a generous amount of grease, which provided both flavor and fat. Once the bacon was cooked, they would mix in a watered-down flour mixture, which had a consistency similar to milk. This combination was sometimes referred to as kush and could also include beef for added protein. On occasion, the mixture would be stewed with crumbled cornbread, creating a more substantial dish. The goal with slosh was to cook it down until most of the liquid evaporated, leaving behind a thicker consistency. This not only made the meal more filling, but also improved its ability to provide lasting sustenance during long marches or days in camp. While slosh was a practical and inexpensive dish, its texture and flavor could vary depending on how long it was cooked and what ingredients were available. An alternative version of slosh was known as slapjack, which was made with even less water. The result was a denser flour paste that was combined with grease and then browned on one side. After cooking the first side, the slapjack would be flipped and cooked through, resulting in a more solid, almost pancake-like texture. Both slosh and slapjack were emblematic of the resourcefulness that soldiers had to develop to make do with limited supplies. They were not gourmet meals, but rather practical solutions to hunger, providing enough calories to keep soldiers going under the harsh conditions of war. Peanut hot chocolate. During the Civil War, chocolate became nearly impossible to obtain in the South due to supply shortages and trade disruptions. In response, people had to think outside the box and get creative in order to replicate the comforting warmth and richness of hot chocolate. One innovative method involved roasting peanuts, removing their skins, and grinding them into a fine powder. This peanut powder was then boiled with milk and sugar, creating a beverage that closely resembled the taste and texture of hot chocolate. Despite the absence of actual chocolate, this homemade concoction was surprisingly well received. Some historical accounts suggest that the resulting drink was quite enjoyable, with a satisfying flavor that provided a comforting substitute for the real thing. This ingenuity in creating a substitute beverage highlights the resilience and adaptability of people in the South, who were accustomed to making do with whatever ingredients they could find during a time of scarcity. The process of turning peanuts into a drinkable form shows the lengths to which individuals went to recreate familiar comforts amidst hardship. It was not just about surviving, it was about maintaining some semblance of normalcy and morale during a challenging time. Tea. Like coffee, tea was also in short supply during the Civil War, leading soldiers on both sides to find creative alternatives. Tea was even more difficult to come by than coffee, so Union and Confederate soldiers began brewing their own tea-like beverages using a variety of plants and herbs found in the wild. Common substitutes included the leaves of black alder, currant, and huckleberry bushes, which were used to create a drink that resembled traditional tea. In addition, some turned to sassafras tree bark, corn, and bran as other viable ingredients to brew a hot tea-like liquid. Another form of tea that gained popularity during the war was beef tea. This was made by simmering chopped beef in boiling water, then draining the liquid to create a broth-like beverage. Beef tea was often served to soldiers in military hospitals, where it was believed to have medicinal properties, providing nourishment and strength to those recovering from illness or injury. Despite its potential benefits, however, it wasn't particularly well liked. One Confederate nurse recalled that her patients often refused to drink it, finding it unappealing, a sentiment shared by many soldiers. The taste was far from desirable, and it became a necessity rather than a comfort. These improvised teas and broths reflect the incredible adaptability of soldiers during a time of scarcity. The widespread use of such creative brews also highlights the broader challenges faced by both soldiers and civilians during the war, who had to adjust their expectations and find ways to cope with the constant shortages of everyday essentials. Milk toast. Milk toast was a simple yet significant meal in a soldier's diet during the Civil War, often made from the most basic and readily available ingredients. The main components of milk toast were hardtack, a dense, dry cracker, and condensed milk, a rare and somewhat expensive commodity at the time. A can of condensed milk could cost around 75 cents, which was quite a luxury for most soldiers. Only those with a sizable bounty, veterans with more resources, or soldiers from wealthier backgrounds could afford such indulgences. For most men, this was a treat that wasn't enjoyed regularly. In addition to milk toast, soldiers found creative ways to make hardtack more enjoyable, though it was far from a gourmet experience. Some soldiers would spread sugar on their hardtack, giving it a hint of sweetness to break the monotony of its dry, bland texture. Others combined it with a variety of other ingredients, trying to make the hardtack more palatable and easier to eat during the long and difficult days of war. Another variation on hardtack was hardtack pudding, which involved crushing the hardtack into powder. Once pulverized, the powder was combined with flour and water to create a crust-like base. Soldiers would then add whatever fruit they had on hand, wrapping it up in the mixture before baking it. This dish, though humble, provided a rare opportunity for soldiers to enjoy something with a little more flavor and substance. These meals highlight the scarcity and simplicity of food during the Civil War, as soldiers had to rely on what was available and make the best of it. Hardtack. Hardtack was one of the most essential and ubiquitous foods in a soldier's diet during the Civil War. Made from just two basic ingredients, flour and water, this simple, cost-effective food offered some nutritional value. Though it was far from exciting, the resulting crackers were extremely hard, which gave rise to the name hardtack. Because of its tough texture, soldiers would often dip it in hot drinks like coffee or tea to soften it and make it more edible. Typically, hardtack was square-shaped, measuring approximately 3 inches by 3 inches and about half an inch thick. Its durability was so extreme that one soldier from Illinois humorously remarked that hardtack was so tough that if soldiers had loaded their rifles with it, they could have defeated their enemies with it in no time. Each soldier was typically given about a pound of hardtack per day, making it a consistent part of their rations throughout the war. However, despite its practicality, hardtack was not without its problems. Due to its lack of preservatives, Hardtack was highly susceptible to mold and insect infestations, especially when it was not stored properly. Soldiers often found that their hardtack over time became infested with bugs or grew moldy, which was particularly unpleasant. According to John Davis Billings, a soldier in the Army of the Potomac, the difference between infested hardtack and untainted hardtack could be nearly impossible to detect, especially in the dim light of camp. Soldiers often had no choice but to eat what they had, regardless of the condition it was in. Water cakes. Water cakes were a straightforward and resourceful dish, crafted from a mixture of lightly beaten eggs, flour, salt, and cold water. These ingredients were combined to form a thick batter, which was then baked into simple cakes. Once prepared, they were typically enjoyed with a bit of butter, making for a modest but satisfying meal. The simplicity of water cakes reflects the scarcity and necessity of making do with what was available, as soldiers and civilians alike had to get creative with their ingredients during the Civil War. For those without eggs, another alternative was the ash cake, a basic yet essential food item. Ash cakes were made by mixing cornmeal with boiling water and a pinch of salt. The resulting dough was shaped into flat, round cakes wrapped in corn husks and placed directly under hot ashes to cook. This method of cooking in the ashes over an open fire was a practical way to prepare food when other cooking equipment was unavailable. The ash cakes were simple, but could sustain soldiers during long marches or battles. When cooked in a pan, the same mixture could produce hoe cakes, which were a slightly different version of the ash cake. Hoe cakes were often more uniform and crispier than their ash-baked counterparts. Alternatively, when baked in an oven, the result was called pone, which was another variation on the cornmeal-based dish. These variations in preparation methods show how cooking techniques were adapted based on available resources, and each version of these cakes provided soldiers and civilians with a quick, dependable source of sustenance. Hog and hominy. Hog and hominy, a dish made from pork and boiled corn, was a staple in Southern cuisine and a versatile meal that could be enjoyed at any time of day. Often served for both breakfast and supper, it paired well with other Southern favorites, such as waffles or corn cakes. In some instances, the dish was accompanied by greens and potatoes, further enriching its simple, hearty flavor. This combination of pork and corn became so deeply ingrained in Southern culture that it was almost symbolic of the region's culinary identity. The association of hog and hominy with the South was so strong that it even influenced political commentary during the Civil War. As Union forces sought to gain control of the Mississippi River, which was a crucial strategic point, President Abraham Lincoln expressed his concerns about the potential success of the Confederacy. He feared that a Confederate victory would lead to an unending supply of hog and hominy, symbolizing not only the Confederacy's access to abundant resources, but also their resilience and self-sufficiency. This observation underscored the significance of the Union's efforts in the Siege of Vicksburg, which took place in 1863. The Siege of Vicksburg was a pivotal moment in the Civil War, as it granted the Union control of the Mississippi River, effectively splitting the Confederacy in two. Lincoln's comment about hog and hominy reflected the broader strategic importance of the region, where the Union recognized that controlling the river would deprive the Confederacy of vital resources and hinder their ability to sustain their forces. The battle over Vicksburg wasn't just about military dominance. It was also about disrupting the economic lifeline that supported the Confederate war effort. Rissoles. During the Civil War, rissoles were a dish that featured a variety of ingredients such as minced meat, fish, clams, or oysters, which were combined with eggs and breadcrumbs. These ingredients were shaped into small cakes or balls, then fried until golden and crispy. To enhance the flavor, a bit of seasoning, often including cayenne pepper, was added, giving the dish a mild kick. While rissoles were not a daily meal for most soldiers or civilians, they were occasionally prepared for special occasions, such as Thanksgiving, providing a comforting and celebratory dish in the midst of hardship. Rissoles were a versatile dish that could be adapted based on the ingredients available. Meat was often scarce during the war, so fish, clams, or oysters became popular alternatives. These ingredients, especially shellfish, were more accessible in some regions and could be sourced from local markets or rivers. The combination of egg and breadcrumbs was a practical way to stretch the available protein and create a filling meal. The act of frying the mixture created a crispy exterior that made the dish more enjoyable to eat, providing a break from the monotony of more basic foods like hardtack or salted meat. Though not as common as simpler meals, rissoles held a place of importance during special events. During Thanksgiving, when families and soldiers alike might have had access to a larger variety of ingredients, rissoles could be made to mark the occasion. Vegetables. During the tumultuous years of the Civil War, access to fresh produce was scarce, and as a result, soldiers often had to rely on dried vegetables as substitutes. These dehydrated vegetables, which included carrots, parsnips, turnips, and various greens, were typically dried and used in soups and stews. The drying process helped preserve the vegetables for long periods, allowing them to be transported and stored in the harsh conditions of wartime. These desiccated vegetables served as a vital replacement for more traditional staples like beans, potatoes, and rice, which were either hard to come by or not easily preserved. To make them more convenient, the dried vegetables were sometimes compressed into blocks or cut into cubes, allowing soldiers to quickly add them to their meals. While the dried vegetables were far from appetizing in appearance or flavor, they provided an essential source of nutrition. One of the key benefits of desiccated vegetables was their ability to combat scurvy, a disease caused by a lack of vitamin C. During the war, when access to fresh fruits and vegetables was limited, the dried versions helped soldiers avoid the debilitating effects of vitamin deficiencies. In addition to scurvy, these dried vegetables also help prevent other nutritional deficiencies that could weaken soldiers and hinder their ability to fight or march. Though not particularly flavorful, desiccated vegetables played a crucial role in maintaining soldiers' health. They were an important part of the military diet, providing the necessary nutrients to keep troops healthy enough to continue their service. Salt beef and salt pork. During the Civil War, salt beef became a fundamental part of soldiers' rations, often interchangeable with salt pork. Both meats were valued for their versatility and were used in a variety of ways to feed the troops. Soldiers and cooks found different methods to prepare these salted meats, from boiling and stewing them with beans to serving them uncooked between pieces of hardtack. The preservation method, salting, allowed the meat to last for extended periods, making it an essential item for soldiers on the move and in camps without reliable access to fresh food. Salt pork, often referred to as an indigestible ration due to its tough and fatty nature, was a common substitute for fresh meat. Despite its tough texture, salt pork became an indispensable part of the soldier's diet, especially in the absence of other protein sources. John Davis Billings, a soldier who chronicled his experiences, noted that although salt pork was difficult to chew, he preferred it over other preserved meats, such as salt horse, salted beef, which could often be musty, rancid, or tough with unpleasant, stringy, or flabby textures. The consistency of salt pork in the soldier's diet, while far from ideal, was a necessary element of sustenance. Its high salt content helped preserve it for long periods, an important quality given the logistical challenges of supplying fresh food to soldiers. Though the food was not the most appetizing, it was reliable, and in times of scarcity, this was often what mattered most. Commissary Brazilian stew. James M. Sanderson, an influential member of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, became increasingly concerned with the unhealthy and inefficient cooking practices used by soldiers in volunteer regiments during the Civil War. The standard cooking methods at the time often led to unsanitary conditions and poor nutrition, exacerbating health issues among soldiers. Determined to improve this situation, Sanderson began to experiment with more effective and hygienic cooking techniques. He sought to optimize the use of limited resources like campfires, cooking pots, and available utensils, making the best use of what soldiers had on hand to prepare food safely and nutritiously. In his efforts to reform camp cuisine, Sanderson advocated for healthier eating practices, advising cooks to reduce the use of excessive fat, sugar, and salt. He also recommended avoiding the overboiling of beans, a common mistake that could result in a less nutritious and less palatable meal. His suggestions were based on both health concerns and the desire to make the most out of the limited provisions available to soldiers. His innovations extended to a variety of meals, as he crafted more than 18 recipes for soups, stews, and meat and vegetable dishes, aimed at providing both sustenance and variety for soldiers. One of Sanderson's most notable creations was the Commissary Brazilian stew, a dish that exemplified his practical approach to cooking. The stew combined cubed beef that was marinated in vinegar, followed by slow cooking with onions over a low flame for several hours. The long cooking process allowed the flavors to meld, creating a hearty and nourishing meal. In some variations of the recipe, potatoes were included to add bulk and make the stew more filling. This stew, along with other recipes developed by Sanderson, was designed not only to improve soldiers' diets, but also to promote better health in the harsh conditions of wartime camps, where food could often be scarce and poorly prepared. Watermelon syrup. During the Civil War, when the supply of sugar became scarce, soldiers often sought out alternative sweeteners to satisfy their cravings for something sweet. Molasses became a common substitute, as it was more readily available than refined sugar. However, as the availability of molasses dwindled over time, soldiers and civilians alike turned to another option: watermelon syrup. This syrup, made from the juice of watermelons, became a favored sweetener in the South during the war, as it was abundant during the summer months when watermelons were in season. Watermelon syrup was not only used by soldiers, but also by Southern civilians, who incorporated it into their daily lives as a substitute for sugar. Alongside watermelon syrup, people also used other regional substitutes like sorghum and persimmons, both of which were available in the South and could provide the necessary sweetness for cooking and baking. The scarcity of traditional sugar and the necessity to find creative alternatives led to the widespread use of these local products during the conflict. In addition to syrup made from watermelon juice, Southerners found innovative ways to utilize other parts of the watermelon plant. For example, watermelon rinds, which would otherwise have been discarded, were often transformed into preserves. These preserves were a practical way to extend the use of the watermelon, providing a sweet treat that could be stored and enjoyed later. This not only helped stretch limited food supplies, but also allowed for a form of food preservation in an era before modern refrigeration. As the Civil War raged on, soldiers and civilians alike had to get creative with what they could find to eat. From roasted rats to hardtack, the resourcefulness of those who lived through it is nothing short of remarkable. If you found this look at Civil War-era survival fascinating, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more fascinating insights into the Old West and beyond. Join us as we uncover even more untold stories from history